Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about junk science and fake news. In his novel 1984, George Orwell wrote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." In order to perpetuate the big lie, propagandists need the public to reject what they can actually see and instead believe narratives. They want the public to reject history and reject what they see and instead believe that the planet is burning up. This photograph of deep snow was taken on the Big Island of Hawaii today. This was Las Vegas, Nevada today, covered in snow. This picture was also taken in Las Vegas a few hours ago. This picture was taken in Death Valley, California, shortly after Christmas. Death Valley is the hottest place in the world, having reached 134 degrees Fahrenheit on July 10, 1913. They were also over 130 degrees on two other days that same week. This is a photograph of snow in Malibu, California last weekend. Santa Barbara, California also had snow this weekend. This photograph of deep snow was taken this afternoon not far from Tucson, Arizona. The mountains east of Taos, New Mexico had about 2 feet of snow in the last 2 days. This is not unusual for New Mexico, but their Senator Udall has been harping on year after year about how global warming has ruined the ski industry there, yet they keep having really good ski seasons. A couple of weeks ago, Japan had record snowfall. Last week, Madrid, Spain had record snowfall. Iowa had record snowfall today. This photograph is of snow halfway down Baja California in Mexico a couple of days ago. Last week, China was experiencing record cold, which led to a huge surge in fossil fuel usage, as well as a large increase in vegetable prices. I could go on like this all day, but that's not the point of this video. The reality is that snow cover during the snow season from December through February has greatly increased across the northern hemisphere over the last 55 years. There's been a huge increase in autumn snow cover, particularly during the last decade. And winter snow cover from December through February has also seen a significant increase. What we're seeing is that cold Arctic air is penetrating further and further south, causing the freeze line to move towards the equator. Places where they used to get rain during autumn and winter are now getting snow. We just looked at a series of photographs showing how extensive the snow cover is this year at southerly latitudes. But Democrats want you to ignore the evidence of your eyes and instead believe the official narrative. Barbara Lee, the climate crisis will continue to devastate our communities and planet if we do not act. It's time to pass a Green New Deal. Earth is now losing 1.2 trillion tons of ice each year, and it's going to blah 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 blah. This is the usual historical propaganda from the Washington Post. The reality is that deaths from natural disasters around the world are down about 90% from 100 years ago. And in the United States, fatality rates from weather events have also declined sharply over the past century. People live longer, safer lives now than at any time in human history, and all this climate hysteria is baseless. Here's a more detailed article from the Wall Street Journal. From Antarctica to the Arctic, the world's ice is melting faster than ever, according to a new global satellite survey that calculated the amount of ice lost from a generation of rising temperatures. Between 1994 and 2017, the Earth lost 28 trillion metric tons of ice, the survey showed. That's an amount roughly equivalent to a sheet of ice 100 meters thick covering the state of Michigan or the entire UK, and the meltwater from so much ice loss has raised sea level just over an inch or so worldwide, the scientists said. It's such a huge amount it's hard to imagine it. Wow, an inch of sea level rise? That sounds really catastrophic. Unless we actually go back and look at history and see that sea level has risen 120 meters or 400 feet in the last 20,000 years. Sea level rose very rapidly from about 15,000 years ago until 8,000 years ago. And since then it's been rising much more slowly. All of this was natural, but supposedly the last inch is man-made. It's difficult to imagine how any academic could be that ridiculous. The Arctic Ocean is believed to have been periodically ice-free during the period from 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, around the time when Stonehenge was built. And 5,000 years ago, trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Now that area is permafrost and there's no trees within 70 kilometers. In 1903, it was reported that New Zealand is socialist and that glaciers were disappearing in Greenland. Comparisons of the descriptions of the Jacobshavn Glacier shows that its edge has receded 8 miles since 1850 and it has lost 20 to 30 feet in depth. The Jacobshavn Glacier showed very rapid retreat from 1851 to 1883, but that glacier has actually grown over the last 3 or 4 years. In 1922, the U.S. Weather Bureau reported that the Arctic was warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. There were few seal in Spitsbergen waters this year, the catch being far under the average. This, however, did not surprise the captain. He pointed out that formerly the waters about Spitsbergen held an even summer temperature of about 3 degrees Celsius. This year recorded temperatures up to 15 degrees Celsius, and last winter the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. Well, that's interesting because there's lots of ice around Spitsbergen right now. There's more ice now than there was 99 years ago. In 1939, it was reported by the world's leading Arctic expert, Dr. Hans Ullmann, that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. Dr. Ullmann was Swedish. It's too bad that Greta Thunberg never had a chance to talk to him. In 1940, it was reported that polar temperatures are, on average, 6 degrees higher than those registered by Nansen 40 years ago. Ice measurements were on average only 6.5 feet against 9.5 to 13 feet from 40 years earlier. The Arctic Ocean lost a lot of ice during the first 40 years of the 20th century, and in 1952, the leading American authority, Dr. William Carlson, reported this. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said last night that polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. The temperature around Spitsbergen has so modified that the sailing time has lengthened from 3 to 8 months of the year. The Arctic was very warm during the first half of the 20th century, and a lot of ice melted, and it had nothing to do with carbon dioxide. Let's go back and look at the Wall Street Journal article again. From Antarctica to the Arctic, the world's ice is melting faster than ever, according to a new global satellite survey. I'm familiar with a number of the techniques being used to do these calculations and know that they're not sound scientifically or mathematically. I'm not going to get into the details of what's wrong with those calculations in this video, but instead I'm going to show you via another mechanism that their claims of accelerated ice loss can't be correct. More than 2,000 years ago, the Greek mathematician Archimedes showed that the easiest way to measure volume of something was to see how much water it displaced. And we have very good long-term data about how much water has been displaced in the world's oceans. These are measurements from the tide gauge at Sydney, Australia since 1885. Sea level at Sydney has risen very slowly over the last 130 years. If the oceans were filling up faster than they used to, we would see an upwards curvature in this trend, but we don't see it. Sea level is rising at the same rate now as it was at the turn of the 20th century. This tells us that sea level rise rates have not accelerated, which also tells us in turn that the amount of ice being lost has not accelerated either. If glaciers were losing more ice than they used to, the oceans would be filling up with water faster, and we would see a non-existent upward curvature. There is no indication from this graph that the rate of sea level rise has accelerated. Some people might argue, well, this is just one location, but that's not a valid argument because water seeks a level surface. If one location in a body of water is rising, then every other location in that body of water has to be rising as well. That's why your swimming pool or your lake has a flat surface. Now let's look at the tide gauge from Lower Manhattan, which has data going back to about 1855. Once again, we can see that sea level is rising at Lower Manhattan at about the same rate as it was when Abraham Lincoln was president. There's no upwards curvature and no reason to believe that sea level rise is accelerating. Sea level appears to be rising faster in New York than it is in Australia, but the reason for that is because the land at New York is sinking, which makes it look like sea level is rising. Let's look at one last tide gauge at Stockholm, Sweden, where the land is rising. It looks like sea level is falling there, but the important thing is that there's no upwards curvature. If glaciers were melting faster and more water was being dumped into the ocean, we would see an upwards curvature, which does not exist. All of these claims that glaciers are melting faster and sea level is rising faster are not based on any legitimate science or mathematics. I could show you dozens or hundreds of similar graphs, and few, if any, of the high-quality long-term stations show an upwards curvature. Put simply, the rate of sea level rise has not accelerated, which also means that the rate of glacial loss has not accelerated either. In 1990, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. Since then, they've changed their story, and they've also changed their data. The black line in this chart shows NASA's sea level graph from 1982, created by Dr. James Hansen, who went on in 1988 to be the climate alarmist who began the scare before Congress. He showed that there was very little sea level rise from 1950 through the mid-1970s. But since then, NASA has changed their post-1950 data, shown in red, and it now shows a lot of sea level rise after 1950. I see this all the time in climate science. Historical data is being changed to match the global warming narrative. Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." NASA is operating as the Ministry of Truth, rewriting history to suit the narrative. Let's look now at some other data which NASA has changed. This is the temperature graph from the capital of Iceland. Iceland warmed very rapidly from 1920 to 1940. This matches all of those newspaper articles we were looking at earlier, which showed a lot of glacial melt during that period. Then Iceland cooled dramatically from the 1940s into the Ice Age scare of the 1970s, and since then it's warmed back up again. We can see that the climate in Iceland is cyclical and has no correlation with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, which have increased steadily during this period. But this didn't suit NASA's global warming agenda, so they simply erased the warmth of the 1940s. NASA has been called out about this publicly on many occasions, and they've made many different versions of Iceland temperature graphs. They keep rewriting the past over and over again, and the disappearance of the warmth of the 1940s is not a coincidence. The ClimateGate scandal occurred 10 years ago when letters from climate scientists were released to the public. In this letter, 3 of the world's leading climate scientists colluded to remove the warmth of the 1940s. From Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, copying Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. So if we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we'd still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So they made a decision to get rid of the warmth of the 1940s and didn't even have any understanding or explanation for why they were doing it. And that's exactly what they did. They got rid of the warmth of the 1940s. This is the real data, and this is the fake data which they tampered with. The warmth of the 1940s disappeared. These people aren't scientists, they're frauds, and they're driving our politicians into insanity. I'll get back to that in a minute, but first let's look at some real science. This is a graph of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is an ocean circulation pattern. The graph goes back to the 1850s. We can see that the graph is very cyclical. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, or AMO, was at a high point around 1880. Then it went down to a cold point around 1910. High point again around 1940. Cold point during the Ice Age scare of the 1970s, and we are once again in a warm phase of the AMO. This obviously is not driven by carbon dioxide. The warmest year was 1878. Let's take a look at that. The winter of 1878 was very famous because it never actually occurred. This is what the Minneapolis Tribune reported on March 19, 1878. A wonderful winter. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There's nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that gives us such a winter and spring as have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we've had no winter weather in Minnesota. It's pretty incredible to think that they had no winter in Minnesota in 1878. And down under in Australia, they had an extremely hot January. January 14th, 1878. Great heat in the interior. Dubbo, Monday, the weather here is frightful. The thermometer for 4 days has been 110 in the shade. The magpies and other birds are so much affected by the heat that they're dropping off the trees. Others are leaving the bush and taking shelter in the houses of the settlers. At Burke yesterday, the heat was 122 in the shade. The fowls are dropping dead in large numbers. There's no sign of rain, and no cattle are traveling. So something was going on with the Earth's climate in 1878. The AMO was at a record high. There was no winter in Minnesota. Australia and many other places were very hot. Obviously, this had nothing to do with carbon dioxide. And the cyclical nature of the AMO also shows us that carbon dioxide does not control the climate. Now let's go back to Barbara Lee's hysterical tweet. The climate crisis will continue to devastate our communities and planet if we do not act. It's time to pass a Green New Deal. We all need to sacrifice. We all need to give up our plane travel. We need to give up our cars. We need to stay locked up in our homes. This is all complete nonsense, and there's nothing new about this sort of hysterical, superstitious thinking about climate. The Aztecs also believed that they could control the climate via sacrifice. They sacrificed tens of thousands of people to control drought. They would keep killing people until the drought went away, and then they decided that they'd killed enough. There's no rational basis to their thinking, and there's no rational basis to Barbara Lee's thinking either. She imagines that she's listening to scientists, but in fact the people she's listening to are just modern-day witch doctors and snake oil salesmen. In 1988, the British Commonwealth said that the only way we could stop climate change was through global communism. Superstition about climate change is a problem which has plagued humanity for eternity. 150 years ago this month, the Brisbane Courier published this article, Imaginary Changes of Climate. 3 consecutive years of drought, while they have stimulated the inventive resources of practical agriculturists, have had the natural effect of calling forth a plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. The same superstitions and the same failure to understand science plagues humanity generation after generation. The press corps knows all about me because they write hit pieces about me all the time, and climate scientists like Michael Mann trash me on Twitter while they have me blocked. But the one thing they won't do is talk to me or debate me, because I will destroy their narrative. What they're doing is not about science, it's not about integrity, it's not about saving the planet. It's about seizing power. They want you to ignore the evidence of your eyes and instead blindly accept their narrative. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on junk science and imaginary changes of climate for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.